Growing up as a kid, to me computers were nothing more than a means for playing games, web surfing and online dating. I saw nothing exciting in them, and that didn't change for 9 years. For that period, I gave up my favorite, Brood War and Half-Life, and developed the experience-based opinion that computers are buggy, get viruses and are ugly as hell. Not seeing myself using them if it wasn't for the mentioned things, I preferred spending my time outdoors, doing graffiti and some other stuff. With the advancements in technology and me becoming obsessed with turntablism, I heard of Serato's first SO box. While buying it was a no-brainer, with that came the question for the laptop I was going to use to run it. Formerly thinking that PCs were the only computers, I really didn't want another one. Plus that I only needed it for scratching and some simple daily tasks. Back then my best friend had a 2G iPhone, and not once ended up explaining me how different Apple was. Although impressed by the design of his phone, I really wasn't into tech, so I never paid attention to his words nor fully comprehended their meaning. One thing was certain, however: at that time those products were scarce in the local area, and that was something I found exceptionally appealing. Time went by, and when entering my first battle, I saw both judges using Mac computers to run their vinyl control systems. Fascinated by the 13 and 17 inches MacBook and MacBook Pro, I no longer had doubts about the laptop I wanted. Luckily, my friend knew a person capable of bringing me one from the States, and soon I had my first MacBook. Using it for a single week and thoroughly changed the way I view computers and everything related to them. Now knowing what the homie meant, in the next months I got the perfect for training, iPod Shuffle and an Airport Express. I guess I became an Apple fanboy. And do you know what? I really did. Because of that and of nowadays popularity gaining trend to criticize Apple, I decided to give you my 2 cents on the subject Mac versus PC, and how I'm going to do it is by addressing the several following things. 1. My short story as an Apple user / fanboy / sheep / whatever you prefer to call it, which by the way I already begun. 2. What made me seriously rethink my loyalty to Apple at the very end of 2018. 3. The ultimate reasons why people like me will always buy Macs. 4. And by commenting on a few myths regarding the topic. Having that said, please forgive me if I say something stupid because I'm not a techie. Keep that in mind. Don't bring the Linux and Macintosh suggestions into the comments. Let's run some intro and dive deep into the first. Although I do not upgrade as regularly as others and never bought a top spec model, I did change quite a few Apple products. Those being the white 2008 MacBook, the 13-inch 2010 MacBook Pro with unibody, and the mid 2012 15-inch MacBook Pro, which until this day I use for everything. Besides that and the mentioned iPod Shuffle, I have daily access to a 12-inch MacBook, and for the same period changed a 3G, 3GS, 4GS and 6 Plus iPhones. Despite Apple no longer supports 2 of them, each laptop still works perfectly fine and has been flawless from the moment of buying to that of switching to the next one. But if that's true, then what the reason for doing the latter was? Well, the truth is that it was I who changed all of those times, so please let me explain. As said earlier, I wanted a laptop for scratching and the white 13-inch was brilliant. Later I got into music production with the machine and the 13-inch unibody delivered the needed performance. Then I fell in love with FL, thus needed a Mac powerful enough to handle projects with countless number of VSTs, and my current 15-inch model was and still is excellent. Actually, it was nothing less even when running Boot Camp for Windows, because ImageWine didn't have a native version of FL Studio for Mac. Thankfully, they made one because I was very close of getting into Logic. Despite the fact it doesn't have a dedicated graphics chip, the same computer allowed me to get into software I didn't mind when buying it. Its 2.6 GHz Core i7 doesn't hold my creativity, even when juggling FL with Photoshop, Illustrator, a word processor and Safari. It didn't do it even when I got into video editing with the not optimized for Apple products Premiere Pro, and neither when switching from a T3i to 80D Canon. And though the exports aren't fast, it crushes Full HD timeline with multiple layers and effects of white. While I do realize that's not 4K and yada yada, you have to understand that this is 2012 model, of which although it is possible, I didn't update the RAM nor the hard drive to an SSD. So, after all, is there anything from my creative work which this Mac, my current Mac, has difficulties handling? Yes, actually there is. That is almost any kind of After Effects work, especially masking and tracking on multiple layers and what is called the Adobe Dynamic Link. Depends on the project, that not just kicks up the fans and give me the beach ball, but also can make the computer completely useless. I mean, let's face it, by almost literally dedicating 2 months of my life and time, I'll hopefully be able to finish a 5-minute clip, meaning I'm not gonna be able to do anything else for that time. Now, is there something to demand that kind of a sacrifice on my behalf? No, for the most part, thankfully there isn't. But do I want to be able to do stuff like that more often? Yes, I do. That not just made me begin planning an upgrade, but also inspired me to start learning some basic stuff about computers, so I can become aware of the kind of a system that work requires. The more I researched, the more interested I became, and soon I was watching YouTube videos and reading articles about comparisons and benchmarking. Little that I knew, my opinion about PCs changed and I came to a few conclusions. The advantages of the PCs. 1. All Adobe products, especially After Effects and Premiere Pro, are optimized, or in other words, specially designed to work better with NVIDIA graphics cards. Having that kind of a GPU allows you to enable what's called CUDA acceleration, and with that make the software take full advantage of the hardware that's inside your machine, especially of the GPU. Apparently, that can create a huge difference not only in render and export times, but also in timeline performance, which to me at least is the most important. 2. While for the most part NVIDIA makes the best GPUs and some of them can be found in the latest high-end PCs, because Apple and NVIDIA don't seem to like each other nowadays, there's no RTXs and neither Quadro cards inside the Macs. 3. You don't have to be limited by Apple nor any other company in that manner. Building your own computer allows you to put the exact hardware preferred by the applications you're using, meaning you get to select all of the components, thus configure a machine perfectly suiting yours and not someone else's needs. By going that route, you get to decide in which parts to invest more, while also having the option to replace them with better ones whenever you want, in a way similar to that of swapping gear in and out from your studio. At least this is what that thing reminds me. 4. There's absolutely no reason to limit yourself if you're a multi-talented person or merely have ADD. You can build a multi-purpose system and in fact buy a specially made for multitasking CPU. Examples of that are the Intel Core i9 and AMD Threadripper series. Yet, to run optimally, CPUs like that and any other need to be properly cooled down, and that brings us to 5. Water cooling is a fantastic way to prevent overheating and make your GPU and CPU run at hard clock speeds. Although Apple doesn't utilize this technology, the same can be found in some high-end pre-built PCs and you can use it when building your own. That and the previous one, however, remind me of something which appears as a huge enigma to me and many others, namely why Apple never puts AMD silicons inside the Macs since they already use AMD video cards. 6. You can buy a pre-built water-cooled desktop or a very powerful laptop to have both Core i9 or the latest gen Core i7 and NVIDIA graphics chips, capable of satisfying the needs of many multi-talented content creators. Examples of that are the Corsair One Pro and the Razer Blade 15, both incredibly powerful, partly updatable and exceptionally aesthetically pleasing. The laptop also comes with a free copy of FL Studio, the software which I and many others prefer and see as the most intuitive of all the AWs. Macs on the other hand come with GarageBand and not Logic. 8. Buying a pre-built is not necessary because nowadays you can pay a company to build a perfectly fitting your needs machine, test it, and then give you a warranty on the whole system. Meaning you get the best of both worlds, the company's support and the option of choosing all of the components yourself. Based on my research, the most respected brands in that field are Puget, Scan, AVA Direct, Origin PC, and Digital Storm. Mentioning them reminds me not just of raw power, but also of gorgeous aesthetics. And that brings us to 9. Yes, in our day and age, you can make people speechless with the look of your PC. And that's not just because of some RGB lighting and etc. In fact, I think those are too much in most cases. The real reason, or at least one of the real reasons, is in the stunningly looking enclosures like the Corsair 570X and the Fentex N2 Evolve, letting you show off all of your powerful and already great looking components and craftsmanship in cable management. A case like that allows you to turn your build into an absolute piece of art. Exactly how I feel about the work of some of the PC enthusiasts I saw on YouTube in terms of both builds and content. To be more precise, however, I'll say that those PCs give me the same feeling I had when as a teenager looked at the iconic Lowrider magazine. Needless to say, it was one of pure admiration. 10. Last but not least, although I do not game and they're getting better and better, when it comes to gaming, Macs still aren't the best. Okay, hopefully by far anyone can tell that I completely understand those things. And do you know what? I actually agree with all of them. But does this mean I'll start using a PC anytime soon? Well, actually it does. In two cases. A, if I get sponsored. B, if I have that much money so I can afford building one purely for fun and experimental purposes. Do you know why is that? Well, because Macs and PCs are not the same, and with the first, I still get something which the second merely can't provide. Not realizing it and saying that besides those in specs and performance, they don't have any differences, thus paying the Apple tax really isn't worthy, is probably the biggest mistake people make when comparing both platforms. So now, after pointing PC's biggest benefits, which by the way were that close from quitting my Apple fanboying back in 2018, let's explain the reasons why those people couldn't be further from the truth. Why I choose Apple. While I agree that there are some great PCs out there and that the concept of building your own can give you literally insane performance, all of that comes with one huge problem. Windows, an issue which, if you ask me, is way worse than having your CPU throttling. If I had to pick a single thing to entirely justify the price of the Apple products, then Windows, and especially staying away from it, would undoubtedly be the one. No, I'm not referring to how beautiful, intuitive, and easy to use macOS is, neither to how that's integrated with the hardware inside. Here I'm talking about the free of suffering and nerve-wracking anxiety experience Mac computers provide. So let me expand on that. More or less powerful, desktops or laptops, mine or someone else's computer, even while running boot camp on a Mac, I had literally terrible experience every single time when using Windows. Although the reasons for that are quite a few actually, several of them pop into my head at the very moment when I start thinking of building my own computer. Issues with Windows. 1. Dealing with viruses and antivirus software. Being such a pain in the ass that not only wastes plenty of time and corrupts important files, but also costs money and happens over and over again. I know. Macs do get viruses. Yeah, I bet they do. Do you know how many all the Macs I had and heard of got for the past decade? Well, 0 if we exclude those on mine after running boot camp and Windows. 2. Drivers and codecs. Finding and installing drivers was something I had to do for all my software and hardware when using Windows. Being a perfect example of that, making the so-called Azure driver work took me several weeks. However, I had to repeat the process when switching from audio control to Scarlett 2i2 interface. And although I did, the same continued to occasionally give me buffer underruns, thus making the sounds I played completely unrecognizable. Now, let's see what happened with the very same sound cards and DAWs on a Mac. Nothing. I just plugged them in and everything was ready for music making and audio recording. Ever since then, I didn't have any issues with them. Different than OS, Windows also doesn't come with some of the essential for video editing codecs like the ProRes. To learn more about that issue, I greatly encourage you to check Philip Boom's blog post about his switch from Mac to PC. There he explains that for a ProRes transcode, he still takes the PC exports to his old trashcan Mac Pro. 3. Crashes and blue screens. Whether it's your PC ran into a problem and needs to restart, a problem has been detected and Windows has been shut down to prevent damage, configuring Windows updates and yada yada, or merely please do not power off or unplug your machine, installing updates and etc. I felt jeopardized at any given time that some of them will happen, I'll lose information, won't be able to save my project and possibly have my computer useless for hours or maybe even a whole day. I mean, this is how long it might take for Windows to install the updates. Different than OS, however, it doesn't ask if I'm ready for it and instead it begins installing them the next time I switch off the computer. I know that Macs crash too. Do you know how many crashes I had? Less than 10 for a decade. And all of them were nothing more than mere restart and reopening of all of the apps I was currently using in that moment. The cool thing, however, is that because of Windows, I developed some OCD about constantly hitting the CMD and S buttons. That way, I always have my files freshly saved in spite of what I'm currently working on. 4. Privacy. Though I do not have any proof of that, here I'll mention something interesting people started talking about recently. Namely, that during those hours of installation, Windows collects my private data so it could later send it to other companies and organizations. Not for anything else, but to merely help them improve their services so they could serve me and others better. Now, ain't that smart and noble? Apple, on the other hand, is well known to value its customers' privacy more than anyone else. In fact, not a while ago, they were even accused by FBI for not providing information that was on the phone or computer of a customer who happened to be criminal, and that I believe must be considered by anyone who's in the market for the same devices. As they say, what happens on the iPhone stays on the iPhone. 5. Lack of user friendliness. Even that this may vary from person to person, I find Windows to be very inconvenient and uneasy to use, so let me give you some examples of that. A. Different than the flawless Force Quit option on a Mac, Windows End Task Manager works only sporadically. B. When compared to Finder, Windows Search is pretty useless. C. There's no preview option, which pisses me off, but nowadays I think you can install some third-party app or plugin in order to be able to do the preview option. In 99% of the time, deleting apps on a Mac boils down to doing just that, deleting them. On Windows, however, that's not enough. There you have to go uninstall the app and probably do a bunch of other stuff just to get those results. Here I'll end by saying that I found Cortana to be very useless as well, and Windows seems to have some very annoying and uninspiring look/design, entirely different than that of the high-end PCs and their components I already told you about. When the facts speak. Now, let me tell you that those facts alone entirely justify the quote-unquote Apple tax. When they speak, even the gods remain silent. When they come into place, things like RTX 2080 Ti's, 16-core Threadrippers, better cooled i9s and pretty cases start looking far less impressive and appealing. That, however, doesn't mean I do not realize how powerful those parts are. And this leads us to some critical points I want to make in this video. What's holding PCs back really isn't the lack of raw power and neither that of part options when building your own. What mainly causes that are two things, Windows and the total lack of reliability. So I think some people should really stop speculating with the former two. 2. People don't buy Macs purely because of their parts and neither because of some benchmarks. Although I always consider the specs, first because of music production and nowadays mostly because of video editing and that I told you about After Effects, the same will never solely determine whether or not I want to buy the computer. What ultimately does that is how I'm going to be able to interact with the machine on a day-to-day basis. Am I going to have a smooth and flawless experience such as with all of my previous Apple devices, to be able to really feel and believe that this computer is an extension of me, or its OS will stay on the way and throttle my own creativity? Is it going to be there for me and just work whenever I need it to, or it will always require some further assistance on my behalf? Since I won't be able to afford another one anytime soon, then am I going to be able to trust this computer with all of my work? Is it going to inspire me and almost quote-unquote invite me to create with it? Or it will make me curse and despise myself because of wasting my savings on some theoretically great hardware, which however comes with a software that's nothing but a fucking drag. When buying an Apple computer, I know that there's no need to worry about any of them. No blue screens, no drivers, and neither antivirus programs. I feel safe and secure because I know that my work and everything that I do on the computer won't be jeopardized. Plus that, the truth to the matter is that Macs are so well put together that even some lower spec models can handle audio and video better than some higher-end PCs. And that's not just solely because of the components inside, but because of how flawlessly the hardware and software are integrated together, especially if you decide to use Apple's own Logic and Final Cut or Final Cut Pro 10. Now, let me tell you something. Though not optimized for Mac, I had fewer issues using beta versions of FL Studio on Mac than I had with the native one on Windows. Here I'd like to clarify that I'm by no means a Microsoft hater and think that in terms of hardware, they actually have some great products. Examples of that are the Xbox One and the Surface Pro series. Based on that, I dare to say that when forced to compete with others, they really deliver. Why they don't do it with Windows is merely because they don't have to. As long as Apple doesn't provide macOS to other companies, Windows will dominate the PC market regardless of how bad it is. Macintosh and Linux really aren't options for 95% of the people, me and most likely you including. And I know what some people will say, Windows is not bad, it's just an open system, but to me those two do not exclude each other. So, in my eyes, that precisely is what cripples the whole concept of custom-built PCs and products like the Razer Blade and the Corsair One Pro. Although I can't deny their appeal, the same literally disappears when I start thinking of dealing with Windows. And now, this is how I feel about it. You may build a similar configuration, maybe even a much better spec machine, but you will never be able to get the same computer. Not just because of the T2 chip and some other parts like the Vega 48 inside the 2019 iMac, but most importantly because of the experience, the build quality, the whole ecosystem, the reliability, and the peace of mind that you have the Mercedes-Benz of all computers. You are a Mac user. You don't need anyone to help you. Neither to rely on some companies or Joe Schmo to fix your computer. Now you're independent of all that, and that independence is something I pay for when buying a Mac. Having a friend who's into PCs and knows the ins and outs of Windows is not required, because now you have not who but Apple to guarantee that everything will work just like it did when you first bought the machine. And based on my experience, it really does with all of their devices. If it didn't, then it would probably take me twice as much time to acquire all of the skills and proficiency I have nowadays. And to me, that's priceless. And although I'm not into cars, mentioning them reminds me of a little comparison. One that came into my head after finding that PC and car enthusiasts often share the same build not buy motto.
Lowrider is built not bought.
Built not bought.
From the frame up.
Cars. Let's say you have a $40,000 budget to buy a single vehicle. You save the money for quite a while and want an excellent and reliable car to also enjoy driving. The same you use for work, family, grocery shopping, gym, and maybe even some traveling. My question is, would you invest your money in a brand new Audi or a BMW or that Mercedes-Benz I already mentioned? Or you're going to build a lowrider, donk, a supercharged Honda, or some slammed old school? Well, I believe that we can all agree that 99% of the people will go with option A, not because they do not appreciate the speed, the art, and the uniqueness that comes with the latter, but because it is the better suitable for the real-life option. And while I believe neither platforms is really perfect, to me personally buying the Mac is like going with option A. And no, it is not the perfect computer, but it's just the ideal for our imperfect world. But hey, if I already had multiple nice cars, then I would definitely build a lowrider or a slammed Beamer with BBSs as another one, purely for fun and experimental purposes. Now, let me comment on some of the biggest myths regarding the topic Mac vs PC. Building a PC is cheaper than buying a Mac. Well, this actually isn't true. You can most definitely buy the cheapest parts available, but what you'd be left with is just that, a bunch of cheap parts and probably no monitor, nor Windows, and neither any of the third-party antivirus software it requires. While some of the parts like the T2 chip aren't available, others you buy for cheap won't have the same quality such as the ones inside the Mac. You won't have the Apple Care, but instead have to deal with all of those things I previously mentioned when speaking of Windows. If you decide to build a high-end rig with premium parts and stunning design like the ones I described in the beginning of the video, then the price wouldn't be that different than those of the Macs. Yet you'll still be on your own and have to deal with Windows. Myth number 2. Macs are preferred by the creative professionals. This is one I partly disagree with, and there are several reasons for that. 1. Being quote-unquote creative professional really isn't required to merely not like Windows and appreciate all that comes with Apple computers. I personally fell in love with Macs years before I got into music production and video editing, so I think that really isn't required. 2. There have been and always will be creative professionals who use PCs, and while that starts with a vast number of music producers like 808 Mafia, Cardo on the Beat, and all of the FL-powered users, including John Gooch, aka Spore, aka FeedMe, it continues with many who are into heavy 3D rendering and motion graphics, examples of the latter being Andrew Kramer and Grayscale Gorilla. Those people's work not just benefits from multiple GPUs, but often requires quadro cards. So is it true that creative people prefer Macs? Well, I guess that entirely depends on the kind of creative work we are talking about. Thus I think the answer is both yes and no. What you'll find when you see someone switching to PC and ranting about it on YouTube is that they are usually sponsored, eventually switch back to Mac in the future, and always have someone to help them with Windows, the build, and the maintenance of the system. Meaning, they more or less become dependent on that person who's into Windows and probably builds PCs for years. In general, most creatives want to be able to create uninterruptedly and not deal with the stuff I mentioned when speaking of Windows. They need their computers to just work. And as we all know, Macs are second to none when it comes to providing that. Thank you for your time.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So yeah guys, that was my 10-year Apple user perspective on the topic Mac versus PC. I'll be more than happy if you take your time to comment whether or not you agree with what I said, despite the computer you're using. Other than that, I hope you like this video and everything I do on this channel. If so, then make sure to click on that big red subscribe and both of the bell notification buttons. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload new stuff. You can also check the full blog post on my website and, as I've mentioned, comment there. Just in case you want to, because you really enjoy my work, you can support me by either making a small donation after visiting my Patreon page or by merely buying the higher quality wave version of my latest track, Self-Sufficiency. Not entirely new, I didn't release it earlier because I lost some files when using Windows, so I had to remake few of the parts. Links for both of those you'll find in the description. Once again, thank you for your time. Peace and I'm out.